The message arrived on a Tuesday morning. It felt exactly like every other morning for the past 300 years. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the human vessel Steadfast, watching the familiar dance of cargo ships, moving between the massive orbital platforms that surrounded the Centauri hub. His coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but he kept sipping it anyway, because that was what humans did during long shifts in space. The communication panel beeped with the soft tone that meant priority. Transmission from Earth Command. Jake walked over and pressed his thumb to the scanner. The message that appeared on his screen was shorter than he expected and longer than he wanted to read. Quiet Step was beginning immediately. Every human in non-human space had 72 hours to pack their personal belongings and report to designated pickup points. They were to leave all equipment operational and transfer all access codes to automated systems. No explanations were to be given to alien personnel beyond standard job termination procedures. Jake read the message 3 times before it made sense. Then he read it again because it still did not make sense. He had been running supply operations in this sector for 15 years. His crew had been here longer. Some of the engineers had grown up on these stations. They were not just leaving jobs. They were leaving home. Down in the engineering section, Chief Technician Amy Foster was elbow deep in the guts of atmospheric processor number 7 when her communication device buzzed. She ignored it at first because the crystalline supervisor, Kekstal, was standing right behind her, watching every move she made with those big compound eyes that never seemed to blink. The processor had been acting strange for weeks. The automated system said everything was normal, but Amy could feel the wrongness in the way the air recyclers hummed. She had learned to trust her instincts after 23 years of keeping alien worlds breathable for species that could not survive in their own atmosphere without constant mechanical help. Her device buzzed again. Then again. Kekstal made the clicking sound that meant impatience in crystalline body language. Amy wiped her hands on her work coveralls and checked the message. The words hit her like a physical blow. 72 hours. Pack personal items only. Transfer all codes to automated systems. Amy looked around the engineering bay that had been her workspace for over 2 decades. Every piece of equipment had been modified by human hands. Every system had been improved by human minds that thought in ways the original alien designers never could. The atmospheric processors were supposed to be fully automated. That was what the crystalline authorities believed. That was what their technical manuals claimed. But Amy knew the truth. She made 17 different manual adjustments every single day to keep the systems running properly. The processors could not function without constant human intervention, but the adjustments were so small and so frequent that they had become invisible. 3 decks up, Dr. Lisa Grant was having the same realization in the Central Administration Office. She managed the complex logistics that kept 47 different alien species supplied with everything they needed to survive in space. Food that would not poison them, atmosphere they could breathe, gravity levels that would not crush their bones or let them float away. The job was supposed to be handled by advanced computer systems that could process thousands of variables simultaneously. But Lisa had learned that computers were very good at following rules and very bad at understanding when rules needed to be broken. Every day she made hundreds of small decisions that kept supply chains running smoothly. She approved exceptions to shipping regulations. She rerouted cargo when transport ships broke down. She balanced the needs of species that hated each other and somehow made them share space stations without starting wars. The Galactic Council believed their civilization ran on sophisticated automation and superior alien intelligence. They had no idea that a human woman with a database management degree from a small college in Ohio was actually keeping their entire supply network from collapsing. Lisa started making lists of everything that would need to be transferred to automated systems. The lists got longer and longer until she realized she was trying to download 25 years of experience into computers that had never been designed to think like humans. Commander Ryan Phillips received the message while he was inspecting the construction of a new hegemony battleship in the Terra Nova shipyards. The ship was beautiful in the way that only military vessels could be beautiful. Every line served a purpose. Every system had been designed for maximum efficiency and reliability. Ryan had been involved in building ships like this one for most of his adult life. He knew every bolt and wire and circuit board. More importantly, he knew all the little tricks. That made the difference between a ship that worked according to specifications and a ship that actually worked in the real universe, where things went wrong and people made mistakes and enemy weapons did not behave the way textbooks said they should. The blueprints for the battleship showed standard hegemony design. But Ryan and his team had made thousands of small improvements over the years. Redundant power systems that were not in the official plans. Armor plating that was slightly thicker than regulation required. Weapon targeting systems that had been quietly upgraded with human software that could think 3 moves ahead of enemy pilots. The hegemony engineers who supervised the shipyards were brilliant scientists and capable administrators. But they had never crawled through the tight spaces between hull plates to reroute power cables by hand. They had never stayed awake for 30 hours straight troubleshooting a life support system that was keeping 10,000 beings alive in the vacuum of space. Ryan looked around the shipyard and tried to imagine it functioning without human workers. The aliens would probably manage somehow. They had built spaceships before humans arrived in the galaxy. But the ships they built now were better than anything their ancestors had dreamed possible. And they did not understand why. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out on thousands of worlds and space stations. Human engineers were reading termination orders and trying to figure out how to explain 3 centuries of accumulated knowledge in 3 days. Human technicians were looking at equipment they had modified so extensively that it barely resembled the original specifications. Human administrators were staring at computer systems that could not possibly handle the complexity of jobs that had grown far beyond their original scope. None of them complained. That was not the human way. They had signed contracts that could be terminated at any time. They had always known this day might come. They just had not expected it to come so quietly, with so little explanation, and with so much left undone. The withdrawal began immediately. Human families packed their belongings and said goodbye to alien neighbors who barely looked up from their daily routines. Human workers transferred access codes to computer systems and walked away from jobs they had been doing for decades. Human children left schools where they had been learning alongside young beings from dozens of different species. By Thursday morning, the evacuation was complete. The last human transport ships disappeared into hyperspace, heading for coordinates that no alien government had ever seen. Behind them, they left a galaxy that looked exactly the same as it had on Monday, but was already beginning to change in ways that no one could predict. The first sign of trouble came exactly 21 days after the last human transport ship had vanished into unexplored space. Communication Relay Station Vega 7 went dark at 14:32 Galactic Standard Time on a Wednesday afternoon. The automated systems registered the failure and immediately dispatched repair drones to investigate the problem. The drones arrived at the relay station 4 hours later and began their diagnostic procedures. They scanned every component, tested every circuit, and analyzed every data stream. According to their readings, everything was functioning perfectly. The relay station was receiving power, processing signals, and operating within normal parameters. But it was not sending or receiving any communications. Supervisor Vekalon of the Vegan Communications Authority scratched his scaled head with one of his forearms, and stared at the diagnostic reports. He had been managing communication networks for 37 years and had never seen anything like this. The drones insisted that nothing was wrong, but half the Outer Rim worlds could not talk to each other. The problem was that Kyle Davis had been the only being in the galaxy who truly understood how quantum entanglement matrices worked when they were installed in communication relays that had been modified 17 different times over the past century. Kyle had learned to read the subtle variations in quantum resonance patterns, the way other people read facial expressions. When a relay started showing signs of instability, Kyle could fix it with adjustments so small that the monitoring systems never even noticed them. But Kyle was gone now, along with all the other humans. The repair drones had been programmed to fix standard communication equipment using standard procedures. They had no idea that Relay Station Vega 7 was no longer standard in any meaningful sense of the word. Vekalon decided to call in a specialist. Dr. Zarbeth was the most brilliant Altarian communications engineer in the sector. She had 3 advanced degrees and had written textbooks on quantum field theory. Surely she could solve a simple relay problem. Dr. Zarbeth arrived 2 days later with a team of technicians and a cargo hold full of testing equipment. She spent a week taking measurements and running calculations. Her instruments told her that the quantum entanglement matrix was operating at exactly the frequency specified in the technical manuals. The power coupling was within acceptable tolerances. The signal processors were functioning normally, but the relay station still would not work. Dr. Zarbeth grew more frustrated with each passing day. She was beginning to suspect that the human technicians had made unauthorized modifications to the equipment. When she searched Kyle Davis's former quarters, she found 3 notebooks filled with handwritten equations and diagrams. That made no sense according to standard communication theory. Kyle had discovered that the quantum fields in this particular region of space were affected by gravitational waves from a nearby pulsar. The effect was so small that it did not show up on any instruments, but it was enough to throw off the delicate balance of the entanglement matrix. Kyle had been making tiny adjustments to compensate for the gravitational interference. Every few days for the past 8 years, Dr. Zarbeth stared at Kyle's notes and felt a cold sensation in her stomach. The equations were brilliant. They showed an understanding of quantum mechanics that went far beyond what any textbook taught. But they were written in Kyle's personal shorthand and referenced measurements that he had apparently been taking with instruments that were not in any official inventory. Meanwhile, similar problems were beginning to appear across the galaxy. The massive atmospheric processors on the agricultural world of Kepler 442 started showing efficiency drops. The crystalline engineers who took over from Amy Foster followed all the standard maintenance procedures, but the processors kept getting worse. Chief Engineer Keckstall brought in a team of specialists from the Crystalline Institute of Technology. They were the best atmospheric engineers their species had ever produced. They analyzed every component of the processors and found them to be in perfect working order. But somehow, the air quality on Kepler 442 was slowly declining. The answer was hidden in Amy Foster's personal logs, which she had kept in a simple text file on her personal computer. Amy had discovered that the atmospheric processors worked fine for most atmospheric conditions, but they had trouble handling the complex mixture of gases that the 17 different species on Kepler 442 needed to breathe. The standard atmospheric mix was supposed to be calculated by the central computer based on the biological requirements of each species. But the computer used average values from databases that had been compiled centuries ago. Amy had learned that individual beings within each species had slightly different needs. Some crystallines needed more humidity. Some hegemony citizens were sensitive to certain trace gases. Some species could not tolerate atmospheric pressure variations of more than 2%. Amy had been manually adjusting the atmospheric mix dozens of times each day to account for these individual differences. The adjustments were so small that they never triggered any alarms, but they made the difference between air that technically met specifications and air that actually kept everyone healthy and comfortable. Without Amy's constant fine-tuning, the atmospheric processors produced air that was technically breathable, but left everyone feeling tired and uncomfortable. Productivity dropped. Medical complaints increased. The crystalline administrators could not understand what was wrong because all their instruments said everything was perfect. The crisis deepened when the hyperspace lanes began showing instability warnings. Captain Ben Murphy had been responsible for maintaining the hyperspace navigation beacons in the Orion sector for 12 years. The beacons were supposed to be completely automated, but Ben had discovered that space itself was not as uniform as the textbooks claimed. Hyperspace travel worked by creating artificial gravity wells that allowed ships to slip between dimensions. The process required incredibly precise calculations based on the local gravitational environment. But gravitational fields were constantly changing as planets moved in their orbits and stars drifted through space. Ben had been making microscopic adjustments to the navigation beacons every few hours to account for these changes. The adjustments were based on his intuitive understanding of how hyperspace fields interacted with normal matter. He could feel when a beacon was starting to drift out of alignment in the same way that a musician could hear when an instrument was going out of tune. Without Ben's constant attention, the hyperspace lanes became increasingly unreliable. Ships that entered hyperspace at the wrong moment found themselves emerging thousands of kilometers off course. Some ships emerged inside asteroid fields. Others found themselves dangerously close to stars or planets. The Galactic Council called an emergency session to address the growing crisis. Ambassador Ziktar of the Hegemony stood at the speaker's podium and addressed the assembled representatives of 47 different species. "We are experiencing temporary difficulties with some of our automated systems," he announced. "Our best scientists are working to resolve these issues. We expect normal operations to resume shortly." But privately, the council members were beginning to worry. The problems were not random equipment failures. They were all connected to systems that had been maintained by human personnel. And the humans were gone, taking their knowledge with them. The galaxy had always prided itself on being more advanced than the primitive species that had only recently learned to travel between stars. But now, 3 weeks after humanity's quiet departure, cracks were beginning to show in the foundation of galactic civilization. 6 months after the humans disappeared, the communication blackouts had spread like a disease across the Outer Rim territories. What started as a single failed relay station had become a cascade of failures that left entire sectors unable to contact each other. Trade ships found themselves stranded in hyperspace when navigation beacons went offline without warning. Worlds that had enjoyed seamless contact with the rest of the galaxy for centuries suddenly found themselves alone in the dark. The Galactic Council's emergency sessions were becoming daily events. Ambassador Vextar from the Altarian Republic stood before the assembly with data tablets clutched in his 6-fingered hands and delivered reports that grew worse each day. 17 hyperspace lanes were now completely unusable. 23 communication relay stations had gone dark. The massive orbital platforms around Terra Prime were slowly drifting out of their assigned positions. "We need to understand the scope of this crisis," Vextar announced to the assembled representatives. "Our initial assessment was that these were isolated equipment failures. We now know that we were wrong. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Every system that was failing had been maintained by human personnel. Every piece of equipment that was malfunctioning had been touched by human hands. The galaxy had built its civilization on the assumption that advanced technology could run itself. But humans had quietly been holding everything together with knowledge that existed nowhere in any official database. Chief Engineer Ben Wright had been responsible for the power distribution network that supplied energy to 47 colonies in the Orion Nebula. The network was supposed to be managed by artificial intelligence systems that could balance power loads and reroute energy when generators went offline. But Ben had learned that the AI systems were not smart enough to handle the complex reality of keeping that many worlds powered simultaneously. The colonies had different energy needs that changed throughout their day cycles. Industrial worlds needed massive amounts of power during their working shifts. Agricultural worlds needed steady power for their growing facilities. Residential worlds needed reliable power for life support systems that could not afford even momentary interruptions. Ben had spent 15 years learning the patterns of each colony's energy consumption. He knew that the mining operations on Kepler 442 always experienced power spikes on Monday mornings when the workers returned from their rest periods. He knew that the atmospheric processors on Vega Prime needed extra power during storm seasons, when they had to work harder to maintain stable air pressure. The AI systems could only react to power demands after they happened. Ben could predict them days in advance and make adjustments that prevented brownouts and system overloads. He had redesigned the power distribution network 17 times over the years, creating custom solutions that existed nowhere in the OEnd. Official documentation. Without Ben's constant attention, the power grid began to fail in ways that the AI systems could not understand or fix. Colonies experienced rolling blackouts. Industrial operations shut down when they could not get enough power to run their equipment. The crystalline authorities brought in teams of their best engineers, but they could not make sense of the modifications that Ben had made to the original systems. Dr. Rachel Stone had been working on biological waste management systems for agricultural worlds for over 20 years. Her job was supposed to be simple. Take the organic waste from cities and farms and process it into fertilizer that could be used to grow more food. The systems were designed to handle the waste products of known species, using established biochemical processes. But Rachel had discovered that waste management was not simple when you were dealing with the biological products of 47 different species, many of whom had dietary habits that were constantly changing as they encountered new foods from other worlds. The standard processing systems could handle waste from individual species, but they broke down when trying to process mixed waste streams that contained biochemical compounds that were never supposed to interact with each other. Rachel had developed custom processing protocols for each agricultural world based on the specific mixture of species that lived there. She had created hybrid bacterial cultures that could break down complex organic compounds that did not exist in nature. Her systems were so efficient that many worlds were producing more fertilizer than they needed and selling the excess to other colonies. When Rachel left, she had transferred her access codes to the automated systems as instructed. But the automated systems could not replicate the delicate balance of bacterial cultures that she had spent years developing. Without her custom protocols, the waste processing systems began to fail catastrophically. The first ecological collapse happened on the agricultural world of Ross 128. The waste processing system produced fertilizer that was toxic to the native plants that the colonists were trying to grow. Crops died in the fields. The colonists had to import food at enormous expense, while teams of Zephyrian scientists tried to figure out what had gone wrong. The Zephyrian scientists were experts in biochemistry and had access to the most advanced laboratory equipment in the galaxy. But they could not understand Rachel's notes, which were written in a mixture of technical jargon and personal observations that only made sense to someone who had spent decades working with living biological systems. Transport operations across the galaxy were grinding to a halt as logistics networks collapsed without human management. Captain Steve Murphy had been responsible for coordinating cargo shipments between 38 different worlds in the Centauri sector. His job was supposed to be handled by computer systems that could track inventory levels and schedule deliveries with mathematical precision. But Steve had learned that mathematics was not enough when dealing with the real world, where cargo ships broke down, weather systems delayed deliveries, and colonies suddenly needed emergency supplies because of unexpected crises. The computer systems could create perfect schedules based on perfect assumptions, but Steve had to deal with imperfect reality. Steve had developed personal relationships with transport captains throughout the sector. He knew which ships were reliable and which ones were likely to develop problems. He knew which colonies were good at paying their bills on time and which ones needed special payment arrangements. He knew how to reroute cargo when hyperspace lanes became unstable and how to find alternative suppliers when regular sources ran out of goods. Without Steve's constant adjustments, the automated logistics systems began to make decisions that looked good on paper but caused disasters in practice. Colonies ran out of essential supplies, while warehouses on other worlds were overstocked with goods that nobody needed. The computer systems could not understand why their mathematically optimal schedules were not working in the real universe. Military forces of the hegemony discovered that their most advanced warships were completely dependent on human modifications that existed nowhere in the official technical specifications. Lieutenant Nina Clark had spent 8 years upgrading the shield systems and weapons targeting computers on the flagship Dominion. Her improvements had been so gradual and so subtle that the hegemony engineers had not even noticed them happening. Nina had learned that the standard shield harmonics were not effective against all types of enemy weapons. She had developed custom frequency patterns that could adapt to different attack methods in real time. Her targeting systems could predict enemy ship movements based on subtle patterns in their engine emissions and maneuvering thrusters. The hegemony's military exercises revealed that their ships were now significantly less effective in combat than they had been 6 months earlier. Enemy ships that should have been easy targets were now escaping or fighting back more effectively. The hegemony commanders could not understand why their superior technology was no longer giving them the advantages they had grown accustomed to. Across the galaxy, similar discoveries were being made every day. The advanced alien civilizations were learning that their technology was not as advanced as they had believed. Their automated systems were not as capable as they had assumed. Their superiority over primitive species like humanity had been an illusion that was now crumbling along with everything else. 1 year after humanity's quiet departure, the great chamber of the Galactic Council echoed with voices raised in anger and desperation. Representatives from dozens of species stood at their speaking platforms, pointing accusatory appendages at each other while their worlds burned with riots and their economies collapsed around them. The careful diplomatic language that had maintained peace for centuries had been replaced by raw panic and barely controlled rage. Ambassador Zektar of the hegemony slammed his 4 fists on the podium and roared at the assembly. How did we become so dependent on a single primitive species without anyone noticing? He demanded. Where were our oversight committees? Where were our quality control inspectors? How did these humans infiltrate every system in our civilization? The truth was more devastating than anyone wanted to admit. The humans had not infiltrated anything. They had been invited in. They had been given jobs that nobody else wanted to do. They had been assigned to maintain systems that everyone assumed were too simple and boring to require real intelligence. And while the galaxy's attention was focused on grand political schemes and technological breakthroughs, the humans had quietly become the invisible foundation that held everything together. The orbital platforms around Terra Prime were now drifting dangerously close to each other. Maintenance Chief Tony Rogers had been responsible for their positioning systems for 18 years. The platforms were supposed to maintain their positions automatically using computer-controlled thrusters. But Tony had discovered that the gravitational fields around HFY were more complex than the original designers had calculated. The planet's 3 moons created tidal forces that changed throughout their orbital cycles. Solar radiation pressure from the nearby star pushed against the platforms with varying intensity depending on their orientation. The magnetic field fluctuations from HFY's molten core created electromagnetic interference that affected the navigation sensors. Tony had learned to feel these forces, the way a sailor learns to feel the wind and currents. He made thousands of tiny thruster adjustments every week to keep the platforms in their proper positions. The adjustments were so small that the automated systems classified them as routine maintenance. But without them, the platforms would slowly drift into each other or fall into the planet's atmosphere. The evacuation of HFY had become the largest emergency operation in galactic history. 6 billion beings had to be relocated to other worlds, while engineering teams desperately tried to prevent the orbital platforms from colliding. The cost of the evacuation was bankrupting the hegemony treasury, and they still had not figured out how to solve the fundamental problem Dr. Helen Brooks had been developing agricultural systems for over 25 years. Her work was supposed to be simple plant breeding and soil management, but Helen had created something far more complex. She had developed hybrid crop strains that could grow in the artificial soil mixtures used on terraformed worlds. Her plants could extract nutrients from soil that would normally be too poor to support agriculture. Helen's genetic modifications were so sophisticated that even the most advanced AI systems could not reverse engineer them. She had created crops that could adapt to changing soil conditions, resist diseases that did not exist on their home worlds, and produce yields that were 3 times higher than anything in the standard agricultural databases. Without Helen's seeds and fertilizer compounds, crop failures spread across the agricultural worlds like a plague. The hybrid plants that had fed hundreds of millions of beings for decades were dying in the fields. The soil that had been productive for generations was suddenly unable to support even basic food crops. Famine followed swiftly. Worlds that had specialized in manufacturing or mining suddenly could not buy enough food to feed their populations. The interplanetary food distribution networks had been designed around the assumption that agricultural worlds would always produce surplus crops. When the surpluses disappeared, entire sectors found themselves facing starvation. The economic collapse was swift and merciless. The Crystalline Trade Federation, which had controlled commerce between 43 different worlds, dissolved when their transportation networks became too unreliable to guarantee deliveries. Insurance companies refused to cover cargo shipments through hyperspace lanes that had become unpredictably dangerous. Banks stopped lending money to businesses that could not prove they could maintain operations without human technical support. Unemployment reached levels not seen since the early days of galactic colonization. Millions of beings who had worked in industries that depended on smooth interplanetary trade found themselves without jobs. Social unrest spread as populations that had enjoyed centuries of prosperity suddenly faced shortages of basic necessities. The Altarian Republic's attempts to find and hire human consultants had become increasingly desperate. Their search teams had located several human settlements in unexplored regions of the galaxy, but the humans were politely refusing all offers to return to their former positions. Captain Lavra Hayes received the Altarian delegation at the new Montana colony with the same professional courtesy the humans had always shown to alien visitors. She listened patiently to their increasingly generous offers of payment and benefits. She reviewed their contracts and technical specifications with the attention to detail that had made humans so valuable as employees. Then she smiled and shook her head. "We appreciate the opportunity," she said in the diplomatic language she had learned during her years working for alien governments. "But we have decided to focus our efforts on building something new here. Something that does not require us to be invisible." The human settlements that the search teams found were thriving in ways that surprised the alien observers. They had developed new technologies that combined human intuition with alien engineering principles. They had created communities that functioned smoothly without the complex bureaucracies that governed alien societies. They had built economies based on cooperation rather than competition. Mayor Paul Henderson of the New Earth Colony explained the human perspective to a desperate delegation from the Zephyrian Collective. "For 300 years, we fixed your problems and you took credit for our solutions," he said without anger or resentment. "We maintained your equipment and you called it primitive maintenance work. We kept your civilization running and you never noticed we existed." The delegation offered enormous sums of money. They promised recognition and respect. They guaranteed that humans would be treated as equal partners rather than invisible servants. But Paul Anderson shook his head again. "You still do not understand," he said. "We are not angry with you. We do not want revenge. We simply want to build something better, something that acknowledges the value of the people who do the work that keeps civilization functioning." The fragmentation of galactic civilization accelerated as individual worlds and sectors gave up on maintaining the old networks and focused on local solutions. Some worlds discovered strengths they had forgotten during the centuries of interdependence. Others struggled, but grew stronger through the process of learning to solve their own problems. The great hyperspace trade routes that had connected distant parts of the galaxy became local networks serving smaller regions where transportation could be more easily managed. Communication systems were rebuilt using simpler technologies that local technicians could understand and maintain. The grand unity of the Galactic Council broke apart into dozens of smaller federations that could function without requiring invisible armies of maintenance workers. The galaxy was learning to appreciate what it had lost, but the lesson was coming at a price that would take generations to pay. The humans had not just walked away from jobs. They had walked away from a civilization that had taken their contributions for granted, and that civilization was discovering that some foundations could not be rebuilt once they had crumbled. 2 years after the quiet step, the galaxy had settled into a new shape that nobody had planned, but everyone had learned to accept. The grand unified civilization that had stretched across thousands of star systems had broken apart into smaller pieces that fit together in different ways. Some worlds thrived in their newfound independence, while others struggled to learn skills they had forgotten during centuries of relying on others to solve their problems. The Crystalline Consortium had been among the proudest and most dismissive of the alien species when humans first offered their services 3 centuries ago. They had accepted human workers only because the jobs were too boring and unimportant for crystalline citizens to waste their time on. Now they were the first to publicly acknowledge their mistake. The great crystal spires of their capital city on Altair 7 were covered with new inscriptions that honored the quiet builders. The monuments told the story of how humans had maintained their civilization for 300 years without asking for recognition or reward. Crystalline children learned about the invisible workers who had kept their world functioning while their ancestors took credit for achievements they had not earned. But the monuments were more than just apologies. They were promises. The Crystalline Consortium had restructured their entire society around the principle that essential work deserved recognition and respect. The beings who maintained their atmospheric processors now received the same honors as their greatest scientists. The technicians who kept their power systems running were celebrated as heroes rather than treated as invisible servants. The Zephyrian Collective had taken a different approach to learning from their mistakes. They had established exchange programs with the human settlements, sending their brightest young minds to study in human communities, where they could learn the integrated approach to system design that had made human solutions so effective. Dr. Kala Vesh was one of the first Zephyrian exchange students to arrive at the new Chicago colony. She had 3 advanced degrees in engineering and had expected to teach the humans about proper scientific methodology. Instead, she found herself learning lessons that no university had ever taught her. The humans did not separate their technical knowledge from their understanding of how systems affected the people who used them. When they designed a water purification system, they considered not just the chemical processes involved, but also how easy the system would be to maintain, how the maintenance schedule would affect the workers' daily lives, and how the system could be modified if the colony's needs changed in the future. Dr. Vesh watched human engineer Mike Chun design a power distribution network for a new residential district. Mike did not just calculate the electrical loads and transformer specifications. He walked through the proposed neighborhood and talked to the families who would live there. He learned about their daily routines and energy consumption patterns. He asked about their plans for the future and how their power needs might change as their children grew up. The power system that Mike designed was more complex than what's standard engineering principles would have produced, but it was also more flexible and more reliable. It could adapt to changing needs without requiring major modifications. It included redundancies that would prevent power failures during emergencies. Most importantly, it had been designed by someone who understood that power systems existed to serve people, not the other way around. The Altarian Republic had learned different lessons from their experience with human workers. They had always prided themselves on their advanced artificial intelligence systems, but they had discovered that intelligence was not the same as wisdom. Their computers could process vast amounts of data and perform complex calculations, but they could not make the kinds of intuitive leaps that had allowed humans to solve problems that should have been impossible. Admiral Keth Renard commanded the first joint human-alien exploration vessel to venture beyond the old boundaries of known space. The ship itself was a symbol of how much had changed in 2 years. The design combined human intuition with alien technology in ways that neither species could have achieved alone. The human crew members were not maintenance workers or technical assistants. They were equal partners in the exploration mission, and their names appeared alongside those of alien officers in the ship's official records. Captain Lara Hayes served as the vessel's chief navigation officer, using her understanding of hyperspace fields to guide the ship through regions where standard navigation systems would have failed. The exploration mission had already discovered 3 new star systems with planets that could support life. But more importantly, it had proven that humans and aliens could work together as equals rather than as masters and servants. The success of the joint mission had inspired similar cooperation, agreements between human settlements and alien governments throughout the galaxy. The economic recovery had been slower and more painful than anyone had hoped, but it had also been more honest than the old system. Worlds that had relied on imports for basic necessities had been forced to develop local industries and agricultural systems. The process had been difficult and expensive, but it had also made them more self-sufficient and less vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. Trade between worlds had resumed, but it was now based on genuine cooperation rather than invisible exploitation. Transport companies hired human logistics specialists as well-paid consultants rather than underpaid maintenance workers. Communication networks were designed with input from human engineers, who were credited as co-designers rather than anonymous technicians. The small human settlement on the moon of Kepler 442 had become a model for this new approach to interspecies cooperation. Engineer Amy Foster had returned to work on atmospheric systems, but this time she was employed as an independent consultant, with a contract that recognized her expertise and guaranteed her fair compensation for her knowledge. Amy's new atmospheric processing systems were more efficient than anything she had built during her years as an anonymous human worker. She had been given the resources and recognition she needed to develop innovative solutions, rather than just maintaining old equipment with improvised repairs. The colonists on Kepler 442 breathed cleaner air than they had ever experienced, and they knew exactly who was responsible for that improvement. The transformation of galactic civilization had not been completed without costs. Millions of beings had suffered during the transition as old systems failed and new ones slowly took their place. Some worlds had never fully recovered from the economic collapse that followed humanity's departure. The great age of easy interstellar travel and commerce was over, replaced by a more modest era of careful cooperation and mutual respect. But something valuable had been gained in the process. The galaxy had learned to appreciate the people who did the essential work that kept civilization functioning. The invisible had become visible. The forgotten had been remembered. The taken for granted had finally been acknowledged. Admiral Chris Taylor stood on the bridge of humanity's newest vessel and watched the transformed galaxy through the observation windows. Human ships now traveled openly through space that had once been forbidden to them. Human colonies traded with alien worlds as equal partners rather than subordinate suppliers. Human children grew up knowing that their work would be valued and their contributions would be recognized. The great illusion of control had indeed crumbled when humanity walked away quietly. But from its ruins had emerged something more honest and more sustainable. The galaxy no longer pretended that civilization maintained itself through superior technology and advanced intelligence. Everyone now understood that civilization was built and sustained by the countless, small acts of care performed by people who chose to serve others. The foundation of the new galactic order was not based on dominance or exploitation, but on mutual respect and shared responsibility. The builders were no longer invisible, and the galaxy was stronger for finally seeing them clearly.